Imagine standing on the edge of a rain-slicked battlefield in 16th century Japan. The air is thick with the scent of wet earth, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. You look down at your hands. Are they calloused from the heavy plow of a peasant, or are they steady from years of lethal training with a katana? In the world of feudal Japan, your identity isn't a choice, it's a birthright, and often it's a death sentence. Most people think of the samurai as a single, uniform class of noble warriors in flashing armor, but that is one of the biggest misconceptions in history. The reality was a rigid, cutthroat hierarchy where the distance between a foot soldier and a warlord was as wide as the Pacific Ocean. If you were born into the wrong rank, you were little more than fodder for the blades of your superiors. But if you rose through the ranks, you held the power of life and death over every person you encountered. Today, we're stepping back into the Sengoku and Edo periods to see exactly where you would have stood on the social ladder. We're breaking down the complex, lethal layers of the samurai class, from the mud-stained infantry to the golden halls of the shogunate. Stay tuned, because by the end of this, you'll know exactly how many bowls of rice your life was worth. To truly understand the samurai, you first have to understand the currency of the era, the koku. In feudal Japan, wealth wasn't measured in gold coins or silver bars, but in rice. One koku was the amount of rice needed to feed one grown man for an entire year. Your rank, your prestige, and your very survival depended on how many koku your lord granted you. It was a society where your paycheck was literally your dinner, and every single person on the hierarchy was fighting for a bigger portion of the harvest. Let's start at the very bottom, at the foundation of this military machine. If you were a commoner with a streak of ambition and a lack of fear, you might find yourself as an Ashigaru. The word literally means lightfoot, and for most of history, these men weren't even considered true samurai. They were the farmers, the laborers, and the peasants who were handed a spear and told to stand in the front line. In the early days of the Sengoku period, being an Ashigaru was a part-time job. You'd plant your crops, wait for the harvest, and then go off to war for a few months when the local lord called. But as the wars became more professional, these men became the backbone of the army. They didn't have the ornate, custom-fitted armor of the legends. They wore okashi-gusoku, or lent armor, mass-produced cheap chest plates often painted with the symbol of their lord, so the commanders could tell which pile of bodies belonged to whom. If you were an Ashigaru, your life was cheap, but your impact was massive. You were the one carrying the heavy matchlock muskets, the teppo, that eventually changed the face of Japanese warfare forever. You stood in the rain, holding long yari spears in a wall of steel, while the high-ranking officers watched from the safety of the hills. Yet this was the only rank where a true commoner could prove his worth and ascend. The most famous figure in Japanese history, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, started as a lowly Ashigaru and ended up ruling the entire country. But don't get comfortable. For every Hideyoshi who rose to the top, 10,000 others died nameless in the mud, forgotten by history. Now here is where it gets interesting. Between the peasants and the true warrior elite sat a group known as the G-samurai. These were the landed warriors. Think of them as the bridge between the peasantry and the nobility. They lived in the villages, managed the local farmers, and held small plots of land. In times of peace, they looked like wealthy farmers. They wore simple robes and worked the land. But when the war horns blew, they strapped on their swords and led the local men into battle. They were fiercely independent, often forming ikki, or leagues, to resist the big warlords who tried to tax them. However, this independence was their downfall. As Japan moved toward the Edo period and total unification, the higher-ups realized that a bunch of armed, independent farmers was a recipe for constant rebellion. The shogunate eventually gave them a brutal choice: give up your swords and stay a farmer, or give up your land and move into the castle town to become a professional, full-time soldier. This moment changed Japan forever, drawing a hard, unbreakable line between those who fought and those who farmed. If you chose the sword and moved to the city, you might become a kachi. These were the foot samurai. Unlike the Ashigaru, the kachi were of true samurai blood. They had the legal right to wear two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, a privilege known as daisho. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a legal status that separated you from the commoners. If a peasant insulted you, your rank gave you the legal right to strike them down on the spot. However, a kachi didn't have the luxury of a horse. They marched on foot alongside the generals, serving as the professional corps of the Lord's army. Their lives were defined by absolute service and bureaucracy. By the time the peaceful Edo period rolled around,
The kachi became the clerks, the police officers, and the low-level administrators of the government. They were the middle class of the warrior world, respected enough to have a surname, but often not wealthy enough to be truly elite. They lived in modest houses in the samurai quarters, perpetually worried about the rising price of rice and the strict expectations of their superiors. But what if you were born into the inner circle? This is where we meet the Hatamoto, the bannermen. These were the elite of the elite, the direct retainers of the shogunate himself. If you were a Hatamoto, you were essentially the shogunate's personal guard and high-level administrative staff. You had the incredibly rare privilege of an audience with the shogunate. You could look him in the eye, something that would get a lower-ranking man executed without a second thought. Hatamoto were often given significant estates and were expected to provide a specific number of soldiers for the shogunate's army based on their rice stipend. They were the bureaucrats, the judges, and the high-ranking officers. Living as a Hatamoto meant living in the shadow of the palace in Edo, navigating a world of strict etiquette, expensive silk robes, and constant political maneuvering. One wrong word or a slight breach of protocol, and you wouldn't just lose your job, you'd be ordered to perform seppuku to restore your family's honor. Just below the Hatamoto were the gokunin. They were also direct vassals of the shogunate, but they were the housemen who didn't have the right of audience. They were the lower-tier elite, often struggling to maintain the expensive lifestyle required of their rank on a shrinking rice stipend. By the late Edo period, many gokunin were actually poorer than the merchants they looked down upon. Imagine being a noble warrior who can't afford to buy new sandals, but still has to maintain the appearance of a high-ranking lord. It was a rank of high prestige, but often crushing secret poverty. Now, let's talk about the true titans of the era, the Daimyo. These were the territorial warlords who ruled over entire provinces. To be a daimyo, your land had to produce at least 10,000 koku of rice a year. Some, like the powerful Shimazu or date clans, produced hundreds of thousands. A daimyo was a king in all but name. They had their own castles, their own private armies, and their own laws. However, even they were kept on a tight leash. The Tokugawa shogunate implemented a system called Senkin Kotai, or alternate attendance. Every other year, the daimyo had to leave their home province and live in the capital city of Edo. When they went back home, they had to leave their wives and children behind as hostages. This travel was incredibly expensive, requiring a massive procession of hundreds of guards and servants. It was a brilliant, albeit cruel way to keep the daimyo too broke and too worried about their families to ever start a rebellion. Even a man who ruled a province was ultimately a servant to the system. At the very top of this pyramid sat the shogun. While the emperor lived in Kyoto as a divine figurehead, the shogun was the man who actually held the reins of power. He was the barbarian subduing generalissimo. Every rank we've discussed, from the spear-wielding Ashigaru to the wealthy daimyo, owed their ultimate allegiance to him. The shogun's word was law. He controlled the mines, the foreign trade, and the distribution of land. It was a position of ultimate power, but also ultimate paranoia. The history of the shogunate is a history of brothers betraying brothers and secret police watching every corner of the country. But there's one more group we have to talk about, the wild guards, the Ronin. A Ronin was a samurai without a master. This could happen if your lord died, if his lands were confiscated, or if you were cast out for a crime. In a society where your entire identity was tied to who you served, being a Ronin was a social death sentence. You were a warrior with no war, a noble with no home. Some Ronin became bodyguards for hire, others turned to banditry, and many simply drifted, teaching swordplay or calligraphy to survive. The most famous story in Japanese history, the 47 Ronin, is all about the struggle of men who lost their place in this rigid hierarchy, but refused to give up their sense of duty. So, if you were transported back to feudal Japan, where would you want to be? Would you take the safety and poverty of a peasant, the high-stakes gamble of a daimyo, or the freedom of a Ronin? The life of a samurai wasn't just about the sword, it was about knowing your place in a world that had no room for those who didn't fit. The hierarchy was designed to bring order to a land of chaos, and for 250 years, it did exactly that, until the modern world came knocking, and the age of the sword finally came to an end. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the ranks of the samurai, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more history coming your way. Let us know in the comments, which rank do you think you'd actually survive in for more than a week? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.